Hi, how are you?
Good, thanks.
First thing is just a comment is that from what I've heard a lot of people say, it sounds like, and I've even had the feeling that it sounds like the administration has its own hidden agenda for this Middle East thing. I don't know.
What do you think?
I don't know if we're really hearing all the information as to why we're really there. All of a sudden, we want to be really good guys in one area, and in other areas of the world, South Africa, other places in the Middle East, we just kind of think, we allow them to do whatever they want to do. The other question is, I was under the understanding that some of the largest oil reserves in the world were in Russia as well as in Mexico. Now, if that is true, why haven't we taken the money that we've already expended in the Middle East crisis, and that would have gone a long way to develop those resources and to help those economies that are in serious shape?
Well, let me put both your comment and the question together and give this answer. I don't know about any secret agenda myself, and I understand what you're saying. It's a reasonable question about why have we gone in here? There are trouble spots in Africa. There are trouble spots in Asia. I support the President's action, and I do because I see this as an unusual and really unprecedented coming together of factors. We have here a leader in Saddam Hussein who has a grand design, who's made no bones about it. He wants to dominate that whole region of the world. We have a leader who has access to enormous oil wealth and has shown that he will use that wealth to build a tremendous army and weapons of mass destruction, and that he is prepared to use those weapons of mass destruction as he has done. So I think we've got a threat here, the likes of which we've not seen for a while in the world, and one of the reasons we're there without question is that we don't want someone this brutal, savage, someone this anti-American to have control of the oil supply in the Middle East. Now, I think it's very important to deal with some of the things you talked about, because I had a hearing in the Senate a while back to explore where else could we get the oil. It's too bad we're so dependent on Middle East oil. It holds us up. It allows a bully like Saddam to have the power to make us his economic slaves if he controls that oil, so long as we're dependent on it. So we look to the Soviet Union. They have some substantial reserves, but nothing like the Middle East. There's actually almost 70% of the world's oil reserves are in that Middle East, Persian Gulf area. Soviets have some potential. Unfortunately, their oil industry is in disrepair like most of the rest of the Soviet economy. I think we ought to go in and help them, and they can help us lessen our dependence on Persian Gulf oil. The Mexicans have some oil, but they're using most of it themselves, and they're not going to be able to export very much. The Venezuelans are allies of ours, a democracy in our hemisphere, and they have the potential to give us some oil, and I think we ought to develop that. But unfortunately, so long as we have a society that is as dependent on oil as we are, we're going to have to depend on the Middle East, because that's where most of the oil is, and that's where I think we ought to really be spending a lot more time than we have been developing a national energy policy, getting back to conservation, which we got into for a while in the 70s, investing in alternate energy sources that are really ready to be made commercially viable. I think that's the way we're going to protect our political and economic security.
Englewood, Florida, you're next.
Thank you. Good morning, Brian.
Morning.
Mr. Lieberman,
yes.
I wonder if you have ever given any consideration to the three tectonic conjoining plates in that area in the Persian Gulf. I have wondered if there are any repercussions to massive weaponry being used in that area that could dislodge those plates and cause a worldwide catastrophe. Thank you.
I think I missed the first part. The plagues?
Tectonic is the word she used, and she's not on the line anymore.
I'm sorry, I'm not.
But her overall question, I think, has to do with whether or not you would be concerned that if all that armament was shoved into that area, that would be a worldwide reaction to that would be devastating.
Well, there's no question that, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and and therefore the drop of the military threat that the Soviet Union has represented, a lot of people have been saying, I think logically, that the greatest threats to American security in the years ahead would not come from the Soviets, our traditional antagonists since the end of the Second World War, but from unstable third world leaders and terrorists. And here we have it coming all together all too quickly in Iraq. What's also happening is a tremendous escalation of arms in that area. by all the participants. And that's not good for them, and it's not good for the rest of the world, because it does threaten an enormous conflagration. It really threatens the potential for the first actual exchange of nuclear weapons that we've seen since the end of the Second World War. So I think we in the United States and the people in that region have a real interest in trying to stop the flow of weapons into that area. And hopefully when we're past this crisis, we can keep together the great powers of the world that have been cooperating on this crisis to stop their businesses from sending the makings of nuclear weapons, chemical, biological weapons into that area, and that we'll be able to impose some kind of arms control regimen there, because otherwise, human nature being what it is, one day there's going to be an explosion.
Senator Lieberman was first elected to the Senate in 1988. He has a Yale law degree. Let's go next to Phoenix, Arizona. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Brian. Good morning, Senator Lieberman.
Good morning.
I'd like to ask you a question about the general attitude of the Bush administration towards Israel. A number of columnists have written that Bush's attitude towards Israel is the most negative of any president since the creation of the State of Israel. And I feel, perhaps not now, but later in the future, they're going to force Israel to have a Mideast peace conference. Now, that sounds, at first look, that sounds like a good idea, but I would feel uncomfortable about the security of Israel to have countries like China and other members of the United Nations determining the fate and security of the State of Israel. I'd like to hear your comments on that. Thank you.
Well, let me just say a little bit about the state of relations between the Bush administration and Israel, and then I'll go on to your specific question about the peace conference. Relations between Israel and America have been family relations since 1948, when Israel was founded, and President Truman gave immediate recognition and therefore gave credibility to the State of Israel. Incidentally, the Soviet Union did quickly at the same time. The relationship has been a family relationship, and as such, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but I think it always remains in the family. President Bush, to one extent, suffers because he follows the Reagan-Schultz administration, and that was probably one of the strongest, if not the strongest, in terms of its support of the State of Israel and our strategic relationship with Israel. By and large, I think there's a good rapport between the Bush administration and Israel. Right now, as you know, Prime Minister Shamir is here in Washington, and I think one of the most important things that has happened is that the President and the Prime Minister had a good personal meeting yesterday. And you know, policy and theory and strategic thinking is all important to the relations among nations, but if two people who are the leaders of the two countries are not getting on well together, that can harm everything else that is going in the right direction. So I think you've got now a better rapport between these two leaders who head these two allied countries. About the peace conference, it has been thrown up over the years, particularly by the Soviet Union in earlier years, and Israel, I think understandably, and America as Israel's ally, has felt that a peace conference was actually a misnomer. What it was an attempt to jam something down Israel's throat. And you know, negotiations about security are never going to be successful that way. You have to convince the participants that they have all have something to gain from it, not that one is going to be ganged up on. It happens now, encouragingly, that the Soviet Union is developing warmer relations with Israel. In fact, today, Foreign Minister Shevardnadze is meeting here in Washington with Prime Minister Shamir, and those two countries are clearly, in my opinion, moving back toward establishing full diplomatic relationships. The Israelis are simply not going to go to a peace conference that's stacked against them. And while the Soviets are friendlier to the Israelis now, I think the Arab nations and some of the other world powers, the Chinese, even the French, who have been somewhat ambivalent at times in their reaction to the Middle East, have to take some steps to give the Israelis confidence that they will not be that people will listen to them, that they will not be pushed into doing something they don't want to do at a peace conference. That's why the Israelis and we have always preferred direct negotiations between the parties. My own hope here is that when the Persian Gulf crisis is over, the United States will have established such strong relations with our moderate Arab allies, not just Egypt, but Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, that we will be in a position with strong relations with Israel, the Saudis, the Gulf states, the Egyptians, to really directly negotiate a peace agreement and steps toward peace. And I think that's probably ultimately a much more hopeful course to take then a peace conference, as good as the idea of a peace conference may sound.
Senator Lieberman.